what I'm going to do is let's do 10 minutes of the 20-minute video, and then we can have some time to talk. What I want you to keep in mind is that we talk a lot about policy system and environment change in doing public health work. Okay, you all familiar with those terms? All right. What happens when the policy you're following is wrong? Okay, so we'll start with that, and I'll show you the video, first 10 minutes, and then you can see the rest anytime online, and the entire script is right here.
The epidemic here is worse than previously estimated, much worse.
The message that's been pushed on us, it's your fault you're fat.
Shouldn't be so hard to get them to run around and play, right?
They have voracious appetites and they don't exercise enough.
It's about how active our kids are.
If you've seen the movie Fed Up, you know that things have gone terribly wrong with the food supply in our country, and even all over the world. Not only are we eating too much food, we're eating and drinking the wrong food. Sugar-sweetened beverages, added sugars in 80% of our food products, and a diet rich in refined grains and other carbohydrates is making a third of our population sick with diseases like diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Even heart disease and some cancers can be blamed on the diet we've been eating over the past 30 years. Who's to blame for this emerging wave of obesity and related metabolic diseases? We've been told that it's our fault for not sticking to the low-fat diet recommended by the U.S. Department of Agriculture through its food pyramid and now MyPlate recommendations. We've also been told that we don't exercise enough. But in fact, we have followed these recommendations. We've dropped the proportion of fats in our diet and even increased our exercise over the past decade. But it hasn't worked. We're getting heavier and sicker every year. So something is terribly wrong with the advice we've been given. Hi, I'm Dr. David Weed, and over the next 20 minutes, I want to follow up on the recommendations laid out in the film Fed Up, as they would apply to people living in the South Coast, including the cities of Fall River and New Bedford. Our area is already experiencing above average disease rates for obesity, diabetes, coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure, and stroke. While the recommendations we're about to hear may seem controversial, they are based on good science and much more likely to lead to healthier lives than following the advice we've been given over the past 30 years that got us into this crisis in the first place. In simple terms, as the movie lays out in detail, on the advice of the government starting in the 1980s, food manufacturers began removing fats from many of the foods we eat. Everything from milk and yogurt to breads, cereals, salad dressings, and even baked potato chips and ice cream have all earned the low-fat designation, thought to not only decrease heart disease, but also to help us lose weight. Boy, were they wrong. With the fats gone, foods were soon laced with added sugars, a form of carbohydrate that's easily absorbed by the body, but if not used for activity, immediately gets stored as body fat. We all thought that it was the fat in foods that was making us fat, when all along it was the carbs. And as the movie points out, even 40% of the people who do not gain a lot of weight on these foods still have gone on to develop metabolic syndrome and diabetes. As we saw in the movie, people who struggle to lose weight eating low-fat foods continue to gain weight even if they exercise strenuously and often. What they don't realize is that the excessive carbohydrates in these foods stimulated their bodies to produce more insulin, which is the hormone responsible for storing unused energy as body fat. In fact, the recommendations of the USDA 30 years ago that all of us should eat 6 to 11 servings of grain, cereals, bread, potatoes, and rice actually fueled the growing obesity crisis. With the help of government subsidies for sugar and corn, wheat, and other grains, food producers followed suit with an abundance of products that were cheap and all so tasty. And we were told that weight loss is all about energy balance. But what we haven't been told is that a calorie is not a calorie if what we're eating is mostly sugar or foods that turn to sugar by the time they hit our stomachs. Today's USDA dietary recommendations still advocate a whopping 300 grams of carbohydrates a day, well over half of what most people can tolerate without steady weight gain. If we wanted to design a program to make the American population fatter, we couldn't have done a better job. Unfortunately, we're now stuck with a food supply that nature never intended us to eat, and that has addicted most of the population to eating, so much so that they won't easily give it up. And we don't just eat 3 times a day. Because carbohydrates digest very quickly, we get hungry again in just a few hours. So now we have to snack throughout the day, every few hours, in response to the blood sugar crashes that we experience on this diet. Even our schools have responded with morning and afternoon snacks that simply maintain the carbohydrate addiction. And here on the South Coast, it doesn't help that our culture often reinforces the high carbohydrate consumption. Whether we're of Portuguese or Latino heritage, we are all too familiar with meals that include rice, potatoes, and lots of bread. Add to that all of the pastries, cakes, cookies, ice cream, and other foods that we're moving from the category of occasional treats to standard parts of every meal. And you have a slowly developing crisis in the making right here in our own communities. So now, not only are we as overweight and obese as the rest of the nation, the rates of diabetes, heart disease, and some cancers are growing even faster. Right now, 1 out of 5 people over the age of 60 in our area has diabetes, and it's the single biggest reason that people are admitted to our hospitals. While we're doing better at keeping people alive with these diseases, the length of time that they are disabled with these illnesses is increasing as people are getting sicker at earlier and earlier ages. Even our teenagers are getting type 2 diabetes, now the largest medical concern for this age group. So do we just sit by and watch as these problems grow? Or is there something we can do about it? While the solution is by no means easy, if we understand what made it happen, there are some solutions. As the movie Fed Up points out, it took over 30 years to get where we are now, so it's going to take a long time to fix the problem. But we can recall that we were in the same place with smoking 30 years ago. Over that time, we instituted laws, policies, and regulations that gradually reduced the addiction to nicotine to less than half of what it once was. Can we do the same with our addiction to high carbohydrate diets? Here are 10 things we can do. What I suggested before was that there is a policy that has not been helpful to the American public. And that policy comes straight out of Washington with the Dietary Advisory Council and their recommendations. Initially in 1980, that we lowered fats in our diets. Anybody heard of that recommendation? Okay, yeah. And sure enough, you might think people don't pay attention to that. Well, some people do, but a lot of people didn't have to because other people were paying attention to it, particularly the food manufacturers. Anybody remember SnackWells? Okay, you probably have to be over 30, I guess. That was the exemplary product because it was fat-free. So off we went with the biggest single experiment on the American public ever designed, which was to lower fats, and nobody said a thing about what you're going to replace them with. When you take fats out of food, what does it taste like? Cardboard, okay? So up went the sugar, and nobody paid any attention to it, okay? So here we are today, 30, 40 years later, in a situation where we have the greatest weight gain ever seen on the face of the earth. By the way, the recommendation to take fats out of the diet was a brand new idea. No one in the history of mankind had ever said that fat was bad for you. Now, how many people here think secretly in their mind that fat's bad for you? Oh, come on, put your hands up. All right. Because we've been taught fat, and especially what? Saturated fat will kill you, right? Heart attack, city. Put fat in your mouth, get fat in your arteries, you're dead, okay? And that message got across to a lot of people, not just the public, but also to professionals. It was taught in medical schools, it was taught in schools of dietetics, taught in nursing schools. probably still is taught in nursing school. If I can guess from the expressions on your face. It's going to take a long time to get that message out. But if you look at the research, okay, and I've got 1,123 research papers. If you want them, I'll give you the CD. Okay, things are changing, particularly in the last 10 years. Heart disease and obesity in that country, because they have enough of the population that has changed their whole recommendation. That came about because when a physician started recommending low-carb, high-fat diets to her patients, she was called before the medical board. What are you doing? This is against regulations. You can't do that. And she said, well, here's the evidence. This is why. And they said, well, we're gonna put you on trial, basically. So they went back and looked at the evidence and looked at what the evidence, the research that she had given them, and they did an about-face, 180 degree, and said, you were right. Okay. And now their recommendations are now for lowering carbohydrates, and if at least not demonizing fat. I'm not saying that they're out there recommending it, but there's no reason to reduce fats in your diet, including saturated fats, because there's no evidence that they do any harm. In fact, it's the sugars and in particular refined carbohydrates that you saw in the video that, and I can get into the biology of that, but only a few of you are nurses. But look at particle density. Okay, look at ApoB. Understand what happens to cause inflammation in arterial walls, and where those high-density lipoproteins come from. Refined carbohydrates and sugars, not from fats. Okay. In fact, it's the cholesterol in your body that's trying to heal the damage that's done from that. So as you look at the science, and more physicians are, Mike Rocha is a physician. Some of you familiar with him? Working here in New Bedford. He brought that up, the video, which is a great video. This is about children's obesity, and it really centers on a group of teens who have been struggling with this by following recommendations. That's what's the tragedy that this video depicts, because here are these kids who are overweight and suffering from it. One kid goes into bariatric surgery, is in such trouble. But what are they doing? They're lowering fats in their diet, okay, and wondering why it's not working, despite they're doing all kinds of exercise and things of that sort. So Katie Couric is the moderator for this, and along with, so the same woman who did Inconvenient Truth are the producers of this film, Lori Davidson. So this is a good one to look at. You can look at the rest of this video, but I want to save at least 10 minutes for some discussion.